Last month, when the Supreme Court struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, a key provision that designates which parts of the country must have federal permission to make changes in election laws, the court essentially opened the door to state-level voter suppression. Since then, the states have wasted no time. In his opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts said, quote, "Our country has changed. But what's happened at the state level in the days since his ruling is evidence that actually it hasn't." A mere 2 hours after the court's decision was announced, Texas officials said they would begin enforcing a strict voter ID requirement. Soon after, 4 more states followed suit. Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and North Carolina are all moving forward with new voter suppression laws that would disproportionately affect minority voters. Those states with an historic predilection for disenfranchising people of color literally rushed to put in place laws that would disenfranchise people of color. Has the country really changed? If one needed more evidence that racism still exists in America, look no further than the office of Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, one of the GOP's rising stars and a possible presidential candidate in 2016. Yesterday, the Washington Free Beacon reported that Jack Hunter, a close aide to Rand Paul and the co-author of the senator's latest book, apparently spent years working as a pro-secessionist radio pundit and neo-Confederate activist. Hunter calls himself the Southern Avenger and is known for wearing a mask emblazoned with the Confederate flag. In blog posts over the years, Hunter has said that Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, had his heart in the right place, that white people are subject to a racial double standard, and that a non-white majority America would simply cease to be America. Joining us now is the director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center, Wendy Weiser, and from Capitol Hill, Democratic Congressman from Minnesota, Keith Ellison. Congressman, I would like to go to you first. I found the Free Beacon's reporting about Jack Hunter, a close aide to Rand Paul, shocking. What did you make of it?
It's shocking, but it's not that surprising. I mean, here's the reality. I mean, there was little doubt what was going to happen once Section 4 was struck down. In fact, Justice Roberts himself had been speaking against it for years. And so when the floodgates got open, the flood waters came right on through. What we've got to do as Americans is stand up and say this is not who we are. We believe that people have a right to vote, full participation without regard to race or color. And we need an awakening, too, because if the neo-Confederates are on the march, the people who believe in equality and inclusion and democracy need to be on the march, too.
Wendy, let's talk about the voter ID laws, because some part of me always wants to think maybe there is something other than dastardly motivations at the root of this. But the science behind voter fraud, there is no voter fraud. 10 cases of in-person voter impersonation since 2000, or 1 in every 15 million prospective voters. It is insane to insinuate and to put in place laws that disenfranchise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people for something that doesn't exist, this idea of voter fraud.
Absolutely, and the problem's actually even worse than that. There are voter ID laws in many states across the country, but these states, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, have put in some of the most restrictive and inflexible voter ID laws with no options for people who don't have those IDs and very difficult paths to obtaining those IDs. And in those states, it was found that it was especially discriminatory. The court in Texas found that this was going to disproportionately affect African American and Latino voters. It blocked it. And the ink wasn't even dry before the Attorney General said, we're moving forward with this.
Jonathan, you've written about, well, you wrote yesterday about Jack Hunter, and we've talked about the sort of Southern strategy and the resurgence of sort of racist era political strategy, and how that has reared its head, if not become in some ways an organizing principle for the modern Republican Party.
Right. Now, I think we have to be a little more careful about the continuation between this and historic voter suppression. John Roberts says we're in a different era, this is all over, it's all behind us. And he's partially right, because it's not the same thing. It's not as extreme, it's not as brutal, it's not as violent, and it's not nearly as bad as what happened, but it is still bad. It is a continuation of the same things. It's a much weaker version of the historic pattern of white conservative majorities putting in laws intended really for no reason other than to suppress the minority vote. Now, again, it's not the same thing. It's a much more marginal effect. They're not disenfranchising the vast majority of minority voters. They're trying to disenfranchise a minority of them. So, but still, I think you have to be careful to really engage with what people like Roberts are saying. They're trying to use the difference to say there's nothing similar, and of course there are some things similar, but you know, there's a middle ground.
Yeah, and I find it, I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that this isn't at least nakedly political to try and suppress the votes of groups that traditionally vote Democratic.
Right. I'm just saying, his basis of the comparison is like the mid 1960s South, where you had 90% or more of the African American population disenfranchised, and you don't have that kind of policy anymore. What you have is policies designed to eliminate a much smaller percentage of the minority vote, which is not to say that they're not terrible policies.
Congressman, I want to ask you.
I got to tell you.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, I think that my friend is taking a very too optimistic of a view. I mean, it's going to start out as being somewhat innocuous, but we don't know where this thing ends up a year from now, 2 years from now. I mean, I think that it's very possible that we will see some things that are glaringly similar to the mid-1960s. My mother, who was born and raised in Natchitoches, Louisiana, tells me that these kind of things and this voter suppression stuff reminds her of the era she grew up in. So I'm not quite prepared to say that it's too much kinder and gentler. Maybe it's not as bad yet, but now that Section 4 has been struck down, we really don't know where this thing is going to go. And I think we ought to be prepared for the worst.
Bob.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that the point of these voter suppression laws is to prevent black people, and in many cases Latinos as well, from voting. That is exactly the same thing people were trying to do in the 1960s. They want to keep you from going in and casting your vote. And the other thing that we should keep in mind is that there are large numbers of people who are being excluded, prevented from voting. It's not like a small group of people here and there. It's tremendous numbers of people who are being kept from casting their ballots. I mean, this is an evil practice. It is a racist practice, and that needs to be kept in mind. And just one more quick point: when Robert says that the country has changed since the 1960s, that is absolutely clear. All you have to do is look around. You know, unless you're nuts, you realize that the country has changed. But the suggestion is that the Voting Rights Act has not been updated since the mid-1960s, and that's absolutely not true. Right. They've been looking at cases of discrimination over the past several years, and the Voting Rights Act has been adjusted to address those situations.
And let me just say, it is not, I mean, I don't know if it's convenient. It is convenient, perhaps, to have news of Jack Hunter come out against this backdrop. Racism and racist theories about America are alive and well and flourishing in the offices of some people who would run for president in 2016, Bill.
Well, Bob's point and Congressman Ellison's point that these laws are specifically designed to keep black folks, Hispanic folks, college students, seniors, people who are who traditionally support Democrats more from voting is exactly right. And I think that my hope is that the Voting Rights Act is, they figure it out in Congress and they try to go back at it. I think we all know that that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well,
but second, that
pessimistic at best.
Right, but second, that in some of these communities where people see that people are actively trying to stop them from voting, engages them and energizes them in a way that they hadn't been energized before.
And Wendy, I want to talk to you about that point. First of all, the black turnout for the last election was up from 2008. The turnout for black voters was 64.7% in 2008, 66.2% in 2012. Keep in mind, though, that the voter suppression laws didn't go into effect. And had the courts not taken action in several states, according to the Brennan Center, as many as 5 million votes might have been lost, which is almost exactly President Obama's popular vote margin over Mitt Romney.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot at stake in these vote suppression laws, and they affect vast numbers of people. And the Voting Rights Act was actually instrumental in blocking a number of them that affected huge numbers of people in Texas, in South Carolina, in Florida. And those would have been in effect in full force in 2012 election if it weren't for the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act is important not only for these big statewide races, but where the real bread and butter happens is at local races, in municipal elections, in school board board elections, where 85% of the discriminatory voting changes that were blocked happen and that affect people in their day-to-day lives. And there, the racism has been really far more widespread, doesn't get the same kind of national attention. So when, for example, a city of Kilmichael, Mississippi cancels an election just after African Americans become a majority of the registered voters, and when just last year in Beaumont, Texas, they rejiggered the election so that the 3 African American school board members wouldn't be able to seek re-election and have shorter terms, we realize we really do need that Voting Rights Act to protect all of our rights to an equal access.
And you're so right. The point about the local level discrimination is shocking and deserving of greater attention. Congressman, before we let you go, is there any reason to be optimistic that Congress, I mean, this is against the backdrop of immigration reform, which it looks like it may fail in the lower chamber. Is there any reason to be optimistic that Congress can do something about these voter suppression laws?
You know what? You absolutely must be optimistic working in this place. And we're going to keep on fighting for it. You know, I'm happy to tell you that I think that members like Jim Brennan and others, real conservatives, are committed to trying to do something. I know that they're moving forward. And so, look, we're gonna push and we're gonna act like it's gonna succeed until it's clear that it can't. That's the only way forward we have.